Welcome back to everybody to Hacking Democracy, this COG Extra that is brought to you by Fabric Ventures. I'm Richard Muirhead, Fabric's managing partner. And here at Fabric, our entire venture investment thesis is based upon the principles of individual ownership of identity, of your personal data, and indeed the very networks, digital networks, upon which our lives have become increasingly dependent. So as we, in these sessions, are looking at how the technology that is democracy might and perhaps must be continuously improved, it's a thrill to be welcoming you here from wherever you happen to be today around the world. So it hasn't been a fantastic month for US pollsters, again, at vast cost in terms of money, and you could argue mis or disinformation. Many companies sought to call the presidential race, but failed, arguably more miserably than they did 4 years ago. Folks are calling for the whole industry to be rethought, rebuilt from the inside out. And perhaps, we will see that happen. Perhaps we will see a move away from the polling industry. And there are alternatives. Would prediction markets, for example, perform better? Ones that source data in a whole variety of other ways, ones that are centralized, ones that are decentralized, and maybe can access better data for that reason. So these are some of the questions that we're going to be addressing in this forthcoming session. It's entitled The Death Knell for Polls, Prediction Markets of the Future. I think I'm just going to go straight ahead and introduce the Chief Executive of Demos, that is Polly McKenzie, who is going to introduce the rest of our expert panel. Polly, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. So I run Demos, which is a UK think tank, and in an age of division and outrage, we exist to build a policy agenda for consensus and positivity and bridge divides. So we do a lot of work around public opinion in order to fulfill that role, which means that we spend a lot of time both doing polling ourselves and analysing polls. And as Richard says, the US election has been one of those experiences where so much expectation and analysis has led to yet again this big navel-gazing conversation. What went wrong? What can we fix in the future? And is it possible even to create a polling model that can navigate and make sense of this extraordinarily complicated set of opinions and ideas and judgments that people are making about our politics? I'm joined by a brilliant panel who can help us explore that today. So first is Gideon Skinner, Research Director of Ipsos Mori. And Ipsos did a range of polling during the general election, so we can hold him fully accountable for that, but also be a bit more generous to him, I expect. Also, Ethan Singer, and I have got that right. It's very confusing having a panel with a Singer and a Skinner, but never mind. Ethan Singer, who is the strategy lead at Polymarket, which is a predictions market. And also finally, my good friend and colleague, Harry Carr, who is the research director and our in-house pollster at Demos. So I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to share their kind of opening thoughts, particularly thinking about the US election, but also the wider question of where polling is getting things right, where prediction markets might be offering us different ways of predicting the future. And then we will open out into a discussion, questions. If you have questions, please do post them and I'll be able to share them with our panelists. So as you listen, if you have thoughts, do share them with us. So I'm going to start with Gideon.
Okay, thanks very much, Polly. And thanks to COGX and Fabric for inviting us to talk to you all this afternoon. I'm going to try to make 3 points. The first of which is just taking a little bit of a historical look back at polling and the performance of the polls, which is to say that this is not new. Unfortunately, this is not the first time that we've had conversations like this about polling. And indeed, ourselves at Ipsos Mori produced a report 4 years ago called The Death of Polling, with a bit of a question mark behind it. We'll be surprised to know that we didn't think it really was. But actually, if you look at the analysis that Will Jennings and other academics have done on the long-term performance of the polls, there isn't any evidence that polls are getting any less accurate. They're still broadly around the world. Kind of the average error is around about 2 points. And that hasn't changed a lot over recent years. And I'm bound to say at this point, I lead the UK polling, and we were not entirely inaccurate last year. But the fact that it's not new tells us three things. The first thing is that we should expect some uncertainty when we're looking at polls, and I'll come to that right at the very end. It does mean that actually, often there are very specific, country-specific issues that affect polling when it doesn't go so well, and that these can be fixed because they can get better over time. But also it means we need to have some sort of framework for thinking about polling and how it can be improved and the challenges it faces. And broadly, what that means for us is that polling isn't something that just measures society and social opinion. It's something that is affected by changes in society as well. And that means, in particular, how changes in society might affect how easy it is for us to get a representative sample and how easy it is for us to predict turnout, which are affected by social changes like polarization, disengagement with politics, and so on. Thinking about the US polls, secondly, it's too early. The big caveat really is to know exactly how the polls have gone. We're still counting still counting votes. It looks like maybe some of the very early hot takes about the performance of polls were being over hasty. And broadly, it looks like the polls called the Biden share pretty accurately. And overall, in aggregate, got many of the states and calls right. Generally, I think we were at Ipsos US. Our central forecast was a narrow Biden win. And I think most of the polls were putting many states, if we allow for margin of error, to say they were too close to call. I don't think they were predicting a Biden landslide. But clearly there was an issue with the Trump share of vote specifically being around about 3 to 4 points underestimated, which has an impact in certain states where some states maybe we thought were too close to call but ended up being reasonable Trump wins, or some states that were we thought were going to be safer for Biden ended up being narrow for Biden wins, even if the end outcome is the same. And we're going to have to look at what are the reasons for that. Again, it's too early to have done all this data analysis, but going back to my original point about a framework for thinking about polls, the sorts of things we'll be looking at are the impact of a very high turnout, whether that had a differential impact on Republican and Democrat voters, the impact of COVID, and specifically the impact of very high levels of postal voting, and if any of those have an impact on the actual sample that we were able to get. So there's still work to do on that, to understand that sort of slight underestimation of the Trump vote, and particularly maybe it may even be very specific issues in specific states that we will need to account. Finally, just looking forward about making sure that polls are going to be interpreted better in the future, there's really kind of two things for us here. The first is that I think we need to have both better communication of uncertainty and better understanding of uncertainty. That's partly down to us as pollsters, but it's also about other media commentators and other commentators understanding what uncertainty is and really maybe being bolder when we are saying it is too close to call. And the second point that I think I'd really like to change when it comes to looking at polls is just this real strong focus on the horse race numbers over and above anything else. That's not why I got into polling. It's not what interests me when it comes to polling. What's interesting are all the other data that we get in polls, trying to tell the story of elections, trying to tell the story of what happens in between elections. And I think often there, when you look at that data from polls, we get a better understanding and a much more richer understanding of what's going on in our politics and in our society. And for me, that's the real value of polls. But I'll stop now.
Really helpful. Thank you very much. Ethan, it's often said that polls are not a prediction, which is true and fair. But the good thing about prediction markets is they at least are attempting to make a prediction. Does that make them better at predicting the future? What's your experience of Polymarket?
So frankly, my view of the election is slightly different than most pollsters out there. Polls are just one piece of the puzzle. They're one piece of the information that's put into the prediction market, the information market. And in the past couple election cycles, we've really seen the rise of decentralized information markets, bringing down the barriers of entry into these information markets and getting the wisdom of the crowds from everybody out there, not just a select few. This helps reduce the bias that we see in a lot of the polls throughout the United States and the world generally. But essentially, the prediction markets are able to absorb all the information from the polls as well as a variety of other sources. And as we know, markets are the best information aggregator there is. When people are forced to put their money where their mouth is, you get a lot of you see a lot of different information than when you simply call somebody up and ask them who they're going to vote for. Especially in the United States, there's a lot of division amongst party lines. You end up having people who say they're voting for one candidate simply to just throw off the pollsters. When you have to put money on the line, there's no ability to do that. And if you do that, you end up losing. And the market corrects for people making decisions that just don't make sense. That's why we saw this election. Prediction markets, information markets, centralized and decentralized, had drastically different views of what was going to happen this election compared to centralized polling companies and statisticians. I mean, 538, The Economist, they predicted the election 94, 97% chance of a Biden victory. Most people predicted a landslide. And what we saw on election night is that nobody really knew what was going to happen. But what we didn't see is that prediction markets and information markets are able to factor that information in real time, and you can see a live feed of what exactly is going on throughout America as the election votes were counted.
Really interesting. Thanks. Harry, you have spent your whole career thus far doing polling and public opinion research. Do you despair? Is Ethan gonna replace you? What do you think?
No, I think there's two kinds of I think there's two kinds of polling which are relevant here, and it's important to note that Demos doesn't do voting intention polling, and the thing that prediction markets definitely can't do is exactly what I'm doing with Demos, which is looking at what public opinion is around things which aren't around voting intention. You can't have a prediction market on how satisfied people are with political leaders or what their views are around any particular policy agenda or what they feel about the world around them. So there's two kinds of polls which are relevant here, and I think neither of them are going to be entirely replaced. Neither of them are going to be dead or completely replaced by prediction markets. One side of that is just not at all, which is things which aren't around that horse race. And even if you take what your takeaway is from the US election and from repeated polling errors over the last high-profile polling errors over the last few years, is that polls are inaccurate by, on a bad year, a handful of points. That still is very, very accurate and useful as information if you're talking about anything at all which isn't voting intention. So on that score, there's a huge amount of use still to be there in polls, even if they're even comparatively bad polls. So if you live in Wisconsin, you must be absolutely sick to death of voting intention polls. They were 7 points-ish off in 2016. They look like being pretty similarly off in 2020, and that is historically very, very far off the average. Polling errors are usually much less than that. But if you're within 7 points on the vast majority of issues, in which aren't around voting intention, there's still really useful information to have that. But there is also the voting intention polls, which I think is the primary focus of what we're talking about today, and where prediction markets are something which is a relevant comparator, and where I think there is an open contest about the way that it's best to look at what's likely to happen. The first question would be, were polls that wrong? And Gideon's absolutely right that we don't have the full results yet, so it's difficult to say exactly how wrong they were. I think pretty accurately is an all right reflection on overall. So it looked like they were around 3 points out on a national scale, which is about average in terms of polling errors if you kind of aggregate them across different democracies across time. So it's not a massive error on the national stage. The issue is that in first past the post style elections, like you get in both the UK and the US, comparatively small errors can obviously make massive differences to what that means in terms of who then gains power. And it was extremely close to Biden losing to Donald Trump winning. Only actually, tens of thousands of votes in the key states would have needed to switch for it to be another Trump win, and that was very different from the story that was being primarily told before the election. And the error looks like it's very similar to 2016, which is a worry for US pollsters, and that's across states as well. So in Georgia, there was no problem really in the 2016 election. They got it pretty much right. No one noticed Georgia because it wasn't seen as a swing state then. It was won by Trump by 5 points. This year, Georgia, again, wasn't a problem at all. They got it almost exactly right. Biden was meant to win by a very, very narrow margin, and Biden won by a very, very narrow margin. In Wisconsin, they got it wrong, and they got it wrong in the same direction by a similar amount. And that's true for lots of the Rust Belt, and true for several other swing states. And there is an open question which we don't know the answer to yet, frankly, as to the extent to which the changes that they made from 2016 to 2020, whether they were useful. So one major one was around including education as a thing to include in the sampling and the weighting processes. And that's a thing that was also learned by several pollsters over the Brexit referendum as well, that newly something which had been something you took into account and you kept an eye on, but wasn't necessarily something that you kind of had as key in your quotas and in your weighting, suddenly became something which was very, very predictive of the way you were voting. That was true in the US as well. With Donald Trump, it suddenly became an issue. Pollsters started waiting for that, but other things seem to have moved around. I think another issue is that in UK and US polls alike, that it seemed that doing the same thing as you had previously can sometimes be better than trying to win the last battle. So we saw in 2015 a massive polling error in the UK. And one of the things that some pollsters tried to look at was, okay, let's really shift the way that we're trying to think about things, particularly around trying to predict turnout, to match what we're actually seeing when it comes to elections, rather than just taking people's word for how likely they are to vote. And then 2017, the pollsters who had made the biggest changes to try to basically assume that the turnout would look similar to how it was done in previous elections, got it vastly wrong. And the pollsters who had actually not tweaked much from 2015 did much better. So there isn't a clear, that even if you can locate exactly where the error was in the previous election, there's absolutely no guarantee that it will be in the same way in the next election. An issue which is slightly undermined by the fact that it actually was really, really unusually in 2020, and the Trump effect might be a factor there. And it might well be that Trump himself is a reason why the errors are kind of as united in the way as you'd expect. It doesn't look like it's a Republican thing that is always undermining the Republicans. If you look at the 2018 midterms, actually the polls were pretty accurate. And if you look at 2012, actually Obama was underrepresented in the polls. In the same states which have then underrepresented Trump in the polls in 2016 and then again in 2020. And finding out what the issue there is going to be really, really difficult. And even if you find it out, tweaking for that won't necessarily guarantee it's going to be right next time. But I am also skeptical that prediction markets are going to necessarily be any better. They're obviously, for one thing, they assume they are massively, they use polls. Polls are a gigantic piece of data that they will be used as a reason why you are putting your money on the prediction markets. So a sway in the polls is going to make a big difference to the prediction markets as well. And if you just take away polls, that doesn't mean prediction markets are going to be much worse. Would be my opinion. Although I'd be interested to know what Ethan's take on that would be if we suddenly went into a world without polls at all. There's also, and you can see some evidence of this, some issues around who is putting the money in. If you're doing a poll, you're trying to get a nationally representative view, and getting that is really, really difficult. And those are the issues that pollsters have. If you are a betting market, you are getting the opinion of people who have the money and the intention to put their money where their mouth is. And if you looked at the prediction markets over on the night of the election, there was some very stupid money going on Trump when Biden should, by all objective understanding of how the numbers have been counted at that stage, should still have been favourite, even if he wasn't as heavy favourite as he had been at the start of the night. And even when essentially the count had been done, we knew that Biden was going to be president. You could still get about 10 cents in the dollar if you put your money on Trump. So I think putting too much trust into what the prediction markets say would be a worry, and there's questions about where that money comes from. If you suddenly made the prediction markets the be all and end all, and the way that you should definitely look at the way that who's going to win presidential elections, especially in the US where money has such a big deal, that you could easily see that being swayed as well, which puts in another thing which I'd worry about from that perspective. And they're also obviously reliant on polls. So for all those reasons, there's a place for prediction markets. They bring in stuff which polls don't and aren't meant to bring into in terms of trying to work out who's going to win. This is probably a thing worth looking at and bearing in mind, but they can't and shouldn't replace polls of voting intention and are completely irrelevant to most of the polling that I do, which, as Gideon says, is the more interesting stuff.
Thanks very much, Harry. So we've got a question there basically from Harry to Ethan around what prediction markets would look like without the input of polls. Do we think that the wisdom of crowds is capable of generating insights without them? But going beyond that, I wonder if we can come back round and explore this question of whether both prediction markets, betting markets, which can up to a point be bought by heavy investment or at least influenced. And there's lots and lots of anecdotes, certainly in UK politics and probably in US as well, of where some of the richer candidate has put money to make the odds narrow in their seat, and therefore then they put out a leaflet that says the odds are narrowing. But also then the broader question of the way in which polls potentially influence turnout, activist enthusiasm, all of this information about what's going to happen in the future, all of these predictions, do they actually affect the outcome? Because, there's an argument put forward by some that all of this predicting is sort of fundamentally anti-democratic because it skews actual voter behavior. What do you think about that kind of soup of issues? I'm going to start with Ethan to respond to Harry's direct question, and then the wider question about influence and impact on actual outcomes.
Definitely. So I think a common misconception with these prediction markets is that money can sway the direction the prediction market is in. That can happen for a very brief period, but what we saw throughout this entire election cycle is we saw some big Trump bets come in, and it moved the market marginally from maybe a 63% chance to a 65% chance. But as soon as the smart money came back in and saw a misalignment, it was brought back down to 63 very rapidly. One whale can come in and move the odds of Trump winning to 99% for 15 minutes. But that's not indicative of where exactly the election is headed. And another interesting point you brought up about where would we be without the existence of polls. So I think definitely polls are important, and they do help gauge sentiment of the public. And in fact, a lot of the predictions that are made on prediction markets and information markets are based off of polls. And frankly, polls do offer an insight to where the public is leaning. In states like Wisconsin, though, the 8-point lead that Biden had, or the 10-point lead that Biden had going into the election, it was obvious on election night that it wasn't going to be that wide in Biden's favor. And watching mainstream media on election night, the American public really didn't know who to believe. You would turn on one channel and Fox News or somebody would be saying Trump is winning. He's winning in all these states. And by the vote counts that were coming in that night, it seemed that he'd been winning a lot of these states that Biden was predicted to win. But then the mail-in voting came in shortly after. And just as someone in the American public looking, you thought Trump really did have a big chance of winning that night. But when you went back to prediction markets, you would see that, okay, Pennsylvania was a 60% chance of Biden winning before, and it's still very similar when it looked like all the Trump votes had come in early and swept it. And then as the week went on, you'd see that as the votes were counted, Biden slowly eked out his win. But it was certainly not a landslide win in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, as had been predicted by a lot of these polls previously. And not to say that these voter polls are wholly inaccurate. I think they just didn't gauge public sentiment previously in the same way that you can given a prediction market. And prediction markets are not necessarily all are monetary based. There's plenty of wisdom of the crowds prediction markets that are just based off of people's opinions. You don't have to put your money there, but those are arguably a bit more influenceable. although they have gleaned some very important insight, simply because when you have thousands of people, if a few people go in one direction, you still end up with very valuable information.
Really interesting. Gideon?
Yep, thank you. So I suppose I'd kind of just very briefly, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on polls versus prediction markets. I sort of slightly take issue with the fact that the two are comparable, in that I think they're just different things. I think it's a slightly sort of category mistake to compare one with the other. They're different things, and it's clear that clearly prediction markets do take into account polls, but it should be absolutely should be obvious in theory that prediction markets have the opportunity to take in lots of other information and data over and above polls. In some ways, the interesting question is, given that you would think in theory prediction markets should always be vastly better than the polls, the question is, so far as I understand the evidence, is why aren't they always vastly better than the polls, given that supposedly they should take lots of other information? But I mean, they're fine. They're another way of predicting what's going on. As far as the influence of the polls themselves go, that you raised, Polly, I think it's a good question, a perennial question. I think it's still one that it's really hard to find definitive answers on the impact it might have. It does seeing your candidate being behind in the polls motivate you to get out and vote, or does it kind of depress you and decide that you can't be bothered and there's no point? I think it's not clear what the actual outcome of all of that is, which I think has probably two consequences. The first of which is that, going back to my original point, we as pollsters and others using and commentating on polls need to be clear about understanding uncertainty and what polls are good at and what polls are not so good at, and understanding their limitations. But secondly, people are interested in polls. I think understanding what your fellow citizens think is a useful part of the democratic process. No pollster is, as far as I know, there's no sensible pollster is kind of daft enough to say that we should have government by opinion poll or government by focus group or anything ridiculous like that. So to say that they should not, we want to ban them, why don't we say we should ban newspapers or we should ban other forms of comment on what's going on? And they do have their faults, they definitely have their limitations, but we are trying to be an objective and independent view on public opinion, which ought to be a useful, if not the only tool in understanding what goes on in a democracy.
Thanks, Gideon. Harry?
So I think there's two things I'd like to pick up. One is on the what if no polls, as a kind of question. I think there is a counterexample which is sort of commonly used usually by apologists of polls, admittedly, but which is the Oldham by-election in 2015 or 2016, can't remember now, which didn't have any polls because all the pollsters were not, there's not much constituency polling anyway because it's very difficult to do and for various reasons. And also it was just after the 2015 general election, which had been a disaster for several pollsters, for most pollsters. And as such, they were touching it with a barge pole. And the narrative that therefore came out, because there was no information about it at all, was that it was really going to be close between UKIP and Labour. And that was on the basis of people going into, journalists going into Oldham and talking to voters, and what both Labour and the UKIP were saying on from their kind of spin rooms or whatever about what they thought was happening. And what the end result was Labour won by 60.60. So that's kind of example of what would happen in all elections, likely. Not that they would always be completely mad in that direction, but there would be no control over what that story is. So what polls do is give you a range in which that is, and then trying to understand what that there is uncertainty around that. polls are fallible, not only in individual ones with a margin of error, but overall there is potential for, and clearly there's consistent issue around there being a skew in the people who talk to pollsters versus and them not being completely representative of everyone, including the ones who don't. But if communicating that and giving people a ballpark and saying, oh, if it's within 5 points, even if you're like Biden was and getting on average 8.9 point leads nationally, and sometimes getting well into double digits, you still aren't guaranteed to win it, but you can be fairly sure that they're favourites, and that's the way to try to think about it, rather than saying you don't know. It could be any of them, and it's entirely based on what the spin rooms say and the kind of gut feeling of journalists and the people that they vox pop in city centres is much worse than polling. I think that's the key thing to kind of bear in mind, that there would still be narratives. They wouldn't, as has definitely been shown by that Oldham election, and I think is probably obvious from the start. Journalists would not refrain from trying to predict what was going to happen and saying if it was going to be close. If they didn't have polls to do that, they would just be doing it on gut instinct rather than having any kind of useful information about it. And that, in my opinion, would be much worse. But that being said, I think it's quite clear that they do make a difference. That there's pretty strong evidence that close elections have much higher turnout rates, and that if you therefore give the information that it's going to be a close race, that you're more likely to get both sides to turn out. But which I think is a good thing. But the alternative is not that no one has any idea and therefore there's no sway in either direction. It's just that they get swayed by something without any evidence at all, rather than uncertain but useful evidence, which is what polls are. The other thing I was going to mention was about prediction markets again, which is a thing around what the extra information is that prediction markets bring in and how useful that is. And I think it's a kind of question which from my side, from what it looks like to me, as someone who hasn't spent a huge amount of time looking at prediction markets, is that there's a tendency, at least in big high-profile elections, for it to be kind of saying that it's going to go in a similar way to what it's done in previous elections. So if you look at 2016, the prediction markets were much less likely to give Brexit a chance than the polls were. If you were following the polls, especially the ones before, the ones prior to the final set of polls, which in general I would tend to push towards you ignoring on the basis that they're more likely to be herding towards one side or the other. The majority of or at least half of the polls in the couple of weeks running up to Brexit was showing it's at least within the margin of error and frequently with Leave ahead. And you would have got pretty good odds, even actually after it was pretty clear that Brexit was going to happen on the betting markets. I know that Ethan's company didn't exist back then, so he gets no blame for this at all. But you could get it, there was silly money, and I think that was likely to be on the basis of what had happened in 2014 in the Scottish referendum, Scottish independence referendum, in 2015 in the general election, in which it was a kind of conservative status quo swing. And then you can also see evidence for the same actually with Trump, which was in the primaries, where again you could get good odds, even when the polls were showing of Republicans that Trump was surely going to win, that actually they were still thinking the status quo was likely to win out, and then he became the Republican nominee. And now when you see it in 2020, what people were predicting was that the same thing as happened last time would happen again, that Trump and the chaotic option, I'm trying to think of the right words, tends to be to overperform, and that will, in this case, that was the case compared with what the polls were showing. But I would question whether that's necessarily wisdom and added usefulness and predictive utility, as opposed to just a sway in a particular direction, which is the way that it happened last time.
So none of us here are journalists, though I confess to having been a journalist at the beginning of my career for 2 full years. So you can hate on me if you like. But I'm really fascinated by this question of we just need to be more transparent about the uncertainty. And, actually pollsters or prediction markets, you guys go on the media and you talk about stuff, and you talk about the margin of error and you say that you're uncertain. And yet, nevertheless, the spin and the headlines and the noise is all generated by simplistic interpretations that, you know, that remove that complexity, because, you know, complexity is boring. And you know what they say about a lie getting around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And the same thing is true for simplicity over complexity. So with the caveat that we can't really fix the media industry from here, do you think that, is it possible to actually change the way these things are interpreted by people outside of the polling industry, the prediction market industry, of people who are data literate, statistically literate? I don't know, is it within our gift even? Gideon?
So it's a big question. I'll try to answer it quickly. I mean, I still think there's things we can do better as pollsters to express this. We do try, but we can probably still do better. Again, as far as it comes to kind of media and journalists, probably much like polls, there are good examples and there are not so good examples. So, you know, we've seen growth in data journalism, for example, you know, and lots of that is great. You know, kind of great visualizations, great understanding, and as you talked about, that ability to explain quite kind of complex issues, but in sort of simple terms and easy to understand terms is a real step forward. At the same time, without coming across as old as I am, you know, you can also see just that focus on the horse race. You know, sort of, I think the way that it's getting worse in the other direction is, you know, one poll with one headline horse race figure gets tweeted on social media and gets pushed out loads, as you say, kind of halfway around the world, regardless of whether it's an outlier or not. And that is difficult. You know, I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is. You know, despite it might have had, you know, there might have been caveats attached to it, or there might have been sort of other data that is more interesting rather than just the horse race. I don't have an immediate answer to that. So, you know, but you know, we can keep on trying to do better.
Ethan, how about, you know, when you're out there in the world talking about your different sorts of information and insight or predictions, do you find that they're interpreted with the nuance or that they're simplified?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's important to note is that there's so many narratives coming across from a drastic number of news sources, especially in the United States. There's a lot of partisan bias attached to the various news outlets that people listen to and read every day. You're going to turn on one channel, you're going to see completely different information than what's on another channel. And I think what's interesting and cool about prediction markets is that they cut through the BS to some extent. You're not going to have drastic differences between Fox News and MSNBC. It's gonna reach an equilibrium somewhere that's pretty close to right. And I think that kind of unbiased equilibrium information can sort of build a new class of journalism, data-based journalism. You can do data-based journalism off of polls, you can do it off of prediction markets, off of information markets, pretty much anything. And you don't necessarily have to look at one market. You can look at a variety of markets that are fairly similar. You can look at certain state markets, and you can look at the presidential election market and kind of build a picture about what could happen. It's not strictly based off of one single market. You can. What's cool about decentralized information markets is that you can have a market on pretty much anything, super specific local markets to macro markets. And using those markets, journalists can build a picture about what's going to happen pretty much anywhere in the world about any event. And that's wholly unique of information markets.
Harry, you used to work for Sky News, a big media organization. Did you find that findings were reported more accurately with more caveats because you were right there in the organization?
Certainly, I think we won some battles to make sure that the nuances were better reported or better reflected in the reporting. But I do think that across all media platforms, it is difficult to get that nuance across. The question, I think, is how we can do that better, and there are some questions that I know the British Polling Council have been working on this to try to make sure that they get those nuances reflected and hammer home the importance of doing that. the downside of that is that more complexity doesn't necessarily mean that people are more likely to understand it. Actually, in fact, I did a poll about this with Sky Data with Cardiff University, looking at what happens when you give people more information and different visualizations about what margins of error mean. And actually, people just got more confused. And the people who had the right answer from the start got less sure that they were right in terms of the way they were interpreting it if you gave them more information. So there isn't an easy answer to it. Trying to get people to understand statistics is not going to be a way to get people to take that uncertainty seriously. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try, but it's an issue that they face. And the question then is it better to have those polls there than not having them? And the answer, I think, for the reasons that I've already outlined, is definitely yes. Although Ethan is definitely right. There's a role for prediction markets, and it's an interesting role, and it takes into account stuff that polling doesn't. Although polling forecasts often do, and don't have some of the downsides that prediction markets do, but aren't available for the vast majority of elections. And prediction markets have a place in that regard. But I think that polling is definitely not dead.
So final question for you all is, prediction markets are this innovation when it comes to trying to work out what's going to happen in elections, right? But whether it's on the prediction market side or within polling, everything is changing. Like, what kind of innovations are we likely to see in these industries or markets over the course of the next 5 to 10 years? What's to look out for? Ethan, what do you reckon about prediction markets and their evolution?
Yeah, definitely. Even in the past 5-7 years, it's pretty clear that decentralized information markets and prediction markets are really the future. Centralized ones are riddled with barriers to entry, fees, and whatnot. And when you cut out those things, you get a much more accurate picture of what's going to happen. So with the rise of Ethereum, which is where Polymarket is built on, you're able to have people from all over the world contributing, and that's really important. And essentially, as we move into the future, we're going to see more people participating. We're going to see more popping up likely, and just the more people that participate, the better the information is what we're seeing simply from the election market and other markets that we've run in the past. By allowing people to join, we're just improving the accuracy and improving what goes on with polls and prediction markets as a whole. That's where we stand.
Harry, what are we going to innovate at Demos?
We're certainly going to innovate. I don't think we'll innovate on voting intention polling. I don't think we're going to go anywhere like that soon. But a thing which for all polls, including the stuff that we do and including voting intention, is finding ways to make sure that your sample is representative. And an issue for the US is and for all pollsters everywhere, is making sure that those samples are the samples of people you are talking to represent the people that they aren't. And this is an example of that being off to a point which is not problematic for the vast majority of the sort of polling that we do, and the vast majority of polling that is done across the world, but is still an issue which you should everyone will be keeping an eye on, and might become more and more difficult. We're seeing fewer and fewer people answering the phone, fewer and fewer people responding to any kind of approach from pollsters. So finding new ways to bring people in and combating those issues. Potentially I suspect this is the thing that US will be looking at, is finding ways to use attitudinal weights, for example, to look at, okay, so we're not able to, at the moment, even if we're getting the right demographics, we're missing something about people who sway towards Trump. Are there, if we can get some gold standard polls which have to limit the sampling bias as far as possible of non-respondents, and then weight towards those to make sure that you're getting the attitudes in the right way, might be a thing. And then there's also a big data thing, and trying to get something which looks at using large unrepresentative samples as an alternative if you're really struggling to get representative ones. They still have similar problems as normal polls do in the sampling, though, and The success of MRP was held up of that with YouGov in 2017. They weren't as successful in 2019. They were very unsuccessful in 2020 in the US. So there are definite challenges to that as well. It's not at all clear that traditional polling via online or via telephone is not going to be the way forward, at least in the short and medium term.
How about you, Gideon, for the final word? Ipsos Mori is a giant of polling and public opinion research more broadly. What's innovation look like for your company?
Well, thanks very much. I'm not going to repeat what Harry said about polling. I think actually probably what's interesting is all the other work that we do. If we're trying to expand our horizons, is newer ways of involving the public. There's sort of a whole movement towards more kind of deliberative approaches to involving the public to talk about what's going on in their worlds. Obviously, lots of use of digital in terms of, particularly nowadays with COVID, although traditional methods will come back, but there's lots of innovative traditional ways of talking to the public, collecting real-time data, ethnography, and so on, and of course building in other data streams, like just being able to look at what the general trends are, what does market data tell us, and so on, which I think is kind of lots of interesting and innovative approaches that will help us, if we move away just from the horse race, getting a better understanding of what our society looks like and involving public opinion more on the decisions that affect us.
Enormously interesting. We've come to the end of our time, but thank you all three of you for sharing your views. I think we have come to the conclusion that polling isn't dead, it's super useful, but prediction markets are also super useful. And actually when the two interact, they can provide new insights, but actually predicting the future is always going to be an inexact science, and people aren't very good at understanding probability. But maybe that's something we can all unite behind, is more statistical education. I have a statistics A-level, so I feel like, pretty top drawer. But then I also did drama, so, I'm a bit of an unusual character. Thank you so much. And thank you for those who have listened and contributed. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Polly. That was great. And thank you to all the panelists. This time, for those who were with us a few minutes ago, I'm not on mute. So that's good. That's a step forward. That was a great little panel. And I think it further underlined, I think, many of the conclusions from today. Our democracy is a work in progress. And in fact, in its most real sense, it is a set of technologies. And so that it is absolutely no surprise that there are both issues and opportunities that lie within the new technologies as they emerge and they get adopted. Democracy is, perhaps you could argue, a birthright, or some people would argue that, but also an earned right in the Ayn Rand sense, and therefore a responsibility that we tend to this over time. It's a kind of an array of rolling experiments, and sometimes, as I mentioned before, kind of forks to entirely different approaches. On the topic from this panel right now, we would think definitely in Fabric that the decentralized prediction markets do have the potential to be agile enough to spring up around many exciting, or kind of the critical issues of the day, however granular or localized, and be able to access a broader and more current set of data, arguably. And if we can get to a point, and people are working on this, and we can have a kind of deterministically verifiable consensus around truth in these networks, including perhaps things like attitudinal weightings that Harry from Demos was just espousing, I think this could be a real step forward. But as summed up, I think polling prediction markets probably still both alive and well. But unfortunately, one of a couple of data sources amongst very many data sources that swirl around your average individual within today's society in an increasingly confusing and sometimes misdirecting fashion. So I think my biggest takeaway from all of the conversation today is that education on what is your right, your privilege, perhaps your responsibility as a part owner of the the democracy you live within, as for each individual, and how that should be expressed, and that further education on not just familiarity or even literacy, but in fact, high levels of competence in social media, how to deal with fact-checking, memes, to do, the whole principle of debating online, and then even as Polly says, maybe some improved education in statistics is pretty pivotal. Probably incorporating yet more technology to be able to do this effectively, and probably, I guess, do this effectively with much more homeschooling if we're not careful. Perhaps the topic of another COG Extra. So with that, I'd just like to thank everybody for tuning in. I hope that you have maybe learned something new, maybe had some interesting thoughts prompted, hopefully maybe even met somebody new on some of the online forums. So do go and try and do that on the COGX platform. Please get back to us with any feedback on anything from the panelists to the topics to the format to the platform itself. And if you do feel so minded, please feel free to follow Fabric Ventures on Fabric_VC on Twitter, and myself, Richard Muirhead, also on Twitter. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye for now.
Want access to more COGX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.